Next up, I think, unless there are further comments or questions, we have our mall master plan, and this is Paris Rutherford and Marichelle Samples.
All right, so last year we had a discussion about master planning for mall redevelopment. And so last year what you saw, we brought forward a couple developers that were actively in the process of redeveloping malls in the DFW area. You also heard from the Assistant Director of Economic Development for the City of Dallas about what kind of goes into mall redevelopment. And then lastly, you heard from Paris, who is our consultant on master planning for mall redevelopment. And in the last year or so, we've been working towards that. And so Paris is here today to give you an update on where we are.
Thanks, Marichelle. Good to see you all. What a great venue to be in. This is wonderful. Thanks for hosting. As Marichelle mentioned, it's been a little while since we had that conversation, but since then, there's been a lot of work on preparing a plan related to Music City Mall, former Vista Ridge Mall, and how to revitalize that property, taking advantage of the assets that are currently there, but in a manner that can be embraced by the market, and then gets the various owners interested, hopefully, and moving forward as well, and then bringing in additional outside capital investors, developers, et cetera, to make a place that will take us into the next few generations. So that's what this is about. As part of the visioning here, you can see some imagery of what's happening around the country, but more specifically in our region, as it relates to redeveloping retail sites and how this could apply to the property itself. So we like to look at things where it's very specific so that the development marketplace can understand how it works, how they can fit in, and how things can proceed forward. So the landowner can understand exactly what they need to do, and the kind of conversations they might need to have with y'all, so that this can be implemented in real time. So what you see here is one of the challenges that I think we understood right away with the mall is the product itself is old. The mall was great when it was built, but that's not a viable real estate product today, as I think we all know. Certainly the sales there show that. And specifically, there's too much of the general lease area. There's too much of the GLA. Some of the anchor parcels, they've gone vacant. That's a problem because for the small shops to work, you have to have an anchoring force to bring people in. So the basic business model of the mall is no longer working. And especially here. There are places like North Park, and other kind of gateway malls, as they call them, that continue on. But generally speaking, a place like Vista Ridge, that's just not the case. So what we've looked at, and go to the next slide, is to create an environment, kind of an overall destination that brings in a range of different uses, daytime into the evening, and allows this place to evolve over time with infill. And different types of projects. So just specifically, and we have talked to the owner of the mall, we've talked to the prior owner as well as the new owner, we've talked to all the owners actually, and everyone seems to be interested and on board. But specifically, this removes the center part of the mall. This kind of oval here is the current, that great skylight that's in the center court, so that gives you a frame of reference. It creates an open space. It refaces small portions of enclosed shopping over here. It allows a grocery store, it allows a cinema to continue. It adds a food hall, it adds restaurants, it adds mixed-use buildings, it adds some housing, it adds some office, and then it sets up these sites, the anchor stores, for redevelopment. Our initial thought was once you create a place, that is walkable, it's exciting, it's interesting, it's visually cool, you know, and it has a good address to it. That usually attracts employment. So the thought was that with these buildings already there, the structure already there, those could be alternative employment destinations. But at the end of the day, there are parcels of land. The former Penny's parcel, the former Macy parcel. Dillard's continues to operate, so we're taking advantage of that proximity. And as you'll see, I think on the next slide, the merchandising strategy is because of Dillard's, there's more clothing, accessories, specialties in this zone. Entertainment, technology, services. You know, the grocery store has what's called iCompete above that, which is a virtual reality space. I think they need to infill that a little bit more, but it is an interesting use. Again, this park area lined with restaurants, that works well with the cinema. We don't know where cinemas are headed in the future, but that investment is still on the ground, they're still operating. So what we do know about cinemas is when you go to the cinema, you take advantage of restaurants and nighttime stuff. So that's really kind of dominating what's happening in this experience. Next slide, please. You see kind of an overall bird's eye looking from south to north of what that could be. What's important for this to work is the mall is set up on an infrastructure plan that was about the mall. Back in the 80s when that was done, it was completely about the mall. There's a real estate agreement that's completely about the mall. It locks it all in. So for there to be any kind of change, the REA, the real estate agreement, would have to be modified or eliminated. Because you know, you can't make any change without the various owners saying, yes, we approve that change. It's essentially like private restrictions. But there's also infrastructural changes that will need to happen. Obviously, none of these streets exist. The open space doesn't exist. There's a pretty complicated grading regimen that was put in place to allow access to the first and second level of the mall. And you know, one thing that was notable getting out there was it's very confusing how to get to the mall. Unless you've been there a million times, you don't know necessarily where the main entrances are, et cetera. So this makes it very clear the main entrance comes in off Vista Ridge, comes in straight into the heart, and there's a slight change in grading to make that work. This is all doable. We had an infrastructure analysis, which I'll get to in a minute, that looked at what the implications of the cost of the infrastructure are from a high-level standpoint. But this gives you a sense it's an urban village, essentially. And the center point of that is the open space. We're keeping the ring road. You know, primary utilities are running in there. Doesn't need to change, but we are adding a grid of streets. Next slide, please. You see in the center, you know, the idea was to keep that steel structure as something that's kind of a remembrance of the past, but still pretty cool moving forward. It's a covered space for special events and music performances, you know, et cetera, that flows into the park. We're looking at the idea of a restaurant and music venue, kind of like if you've been to West Village and you've been to the Rustic there, that's an exciting thing. We don't have, you know, a single family area right here, so to have, you know, that kind of vibrancy going on is a good thing. You know, small kiosks, obviously parking on the streets as well as parking in garages, and I'll come back to that. You know, we talked about a food hall and a portion of it. You can see some of the mixed-use buildings beyond, that's further to the south. You know, obviously, full design would need to happen with private ownership about fountains and all the niceties that go in, but this gives you a sense of what it could be in the middle. Next slide, please. This is the street that's on the south side of the park that runs. Dillard's is off in the distance. And you can see some mixed-use buildings here that are overlooking that space as well as the open space. You see the edge of the food hall there, strung lights, wide sidewalks, ample planting, cool signage. All those elements are things that are necessary for a space like this to be successful. What's also important is that there's a range of uses in here that get people here during the daytime and at night. So for instance, in these mixed-use buildings in the southern portion of the site, that's really the back end of the site. It doesn't have any visibility from highways or anything, so residential makes sense there. We were looking at employment uses where they can be seen but still plug into this plan. So at night, there are folks home looking out into that space, walking down, hopefully cruising around. During the daytime, you have employment doing the same thing. That was the idea. Next slide. This is from the south looking north. You see the current skylight structure. You see the music venue, restaurant venue residential and mixed-use buildings framing a street, taking you up there, strung lights in those important streets. Next slide. So let's talk about the infrastructure. So we worked with the civil engineering firm to identify what the mains would be. Again, right now, with how the mall is set up, the infrastructure feeds the mall and each one of the stores. Obviously, it didn't contemplate a street grid like this. There was no street grid. There was the ring road, and then you had just a whole bunch of different lines that came and fed that. So this takes, of course, anywhere there's projects that are infilling, it takes the infrastructure and aligns it into those streets, just like normal. So those streets would be, realistically, I think probably public rights-of-way or at a minimum public easements, so that you've got control, you know what that neighborhood is over time. But it gets a framework in place so that it allows things to change over time. So you can see it's this opinion of probable cost that HKS engineers put together at 18 million, that's for the primary framework. Keeping in mind, this is a phased project. This doesn't happen all at once. I do suspect that there's a fair amount of market interest for a good portion of this to get going. But we haven't shown, for instance, a redo of the anchor stores. We haven't shown that. We're assuming that, those buildings remain. We're infilling, these mixed-use projects, eliminating the central retail area to create that park. And you kind of see that breakdown there. So it gives you a sense, order of magnitude of what would be required by some party that hasn't been determined for this property to get redeveloped from an infrastructure standpoint. Next slide. Now, what's also important, you can't see this in detail, but maybe in your packet, we did take just a general look at the program. So you can see the program, you can see the parking that's required, you see the existing mall and what's being removed, and we put basic numbers to that to understand what the incremental value might be that comes beyond where the mall is right now, and it's pretty significant in terms of the amount of investment that reflects there at the bottom. Obviously, that depends entirely on what's built, but just to get a sense of, from a revenue standpoint, what we're looking at. Next slide. Finally, so what this really is it's a master development, just like a master plan community, but at a smaller scale. So there's a primary owner, that's the mall owner. They own the majority of the land. Then you have some other owners that have blocks of land. But for the change, the retrofit to this to occur, the owner is essentially taking on a master development role, possibly with you all in a possible partnership. And I say that because of the infrastructure, maybe some of the parking that might be involved. But the city potentially could work with the mall owner to prepare a partnership with tools. We'd need to have a surveyed master parcel plan. There's a development schedule working with them that would need to be aligned. They're having conversations in the market, so forth and so on. There'd be a finance plan identifying sources and uses, whether it's infrastructure or parking or somewhere in between. Because I can tell you that the costs that you saw earlier, that's not something typically that a group like this that owns an asset like this would do on their own, particularly if we're looking at retail. But the good news is some of the other uses that come in will have some site costs as part of their development budget, so that needs to be negotiated. So I don't think anyone is expecting full amounts to be covered by any one party. But those details need to be figured out as part of that master coordinating strategy. And then, in our opinion, with if you had an MDA, a master development agreement with the mall owner, if you had that agreed to in concept, and if they showed you that the REA, the private restrictions, have been removed, then you'd be able to go through a zoning process, because obviously this requires a rezone, and then get into public improvements and kick off the project, essentially. But what's important to me is, why would the city do this? The city would do this to, first of all, change something that's failing right now, make it better. But secondly, to get the additional revenue from a tax standpoint to start coming into the city coffers. And it's not to create an environment where a landowner can have positive speculation and trump up the value of their land with new zoning. That's not what I would recommend. That's a part of the process that has to happen. but it's not, this shouldn't be a land deal. This should be a development deal, if that makes sense. The mall owner, meanwhile, needs to work with their adjacent owners to figure out the REA. Obviously work with you all on an MDA, the Master Development Agreement. Work on the design with you all on the infrastructure and improvements. Look at a joint marketing and rebranding plan. Engage the brokerage community, the stuff that you heard last year from some of the folks that have been going through that process. And then start the land sale program. So at that point, when they have zoning, they have, there's an understanding of how the infrastructure is being delivered in a phased basis. At that point, then they can open their doors. And they're not going to be going vertical on everything, I don't think. They would sell land to folks that would be developing mixed use, for instance, or office. But because they own the retail itself, they would be doing that retrofit. Or maybe they might bring in a party to work with them, but that's their responsibility to kind of close up the gaps, do the demolition, close up the gaps, and then put the niceties in working with you. So this is a real simple outline. There's about 100 tasks under each bullet point, but it gives you a sense of how this works, and it puts the city in a slightly different role than it usually is in. It's not to say the city's a master developer, you're not, but you're not just a regulating body in this case. You are in a development partnership, I think, in order for this to get done. And you're probably providing some funding to make this work, and you're probably being a little more proactive than you might ordinarily be, because this is a complicated deal. As you heard from some of the folks before, there's not a lot of these that are going on around the country at such a big scale, because it's a big scale and they're very complicated, and it takes a lot of time and energy, and I think the folks that you've talked to have already been working their deals for years at this point. So it's a big effort, but the rewards, as you saw on the revenue side, are pretty good.
Mayor and Council, I did want to point out, I've been very impressed with this project, primarily because there's only 2 or 3 developers in the nation that would just buy a mall straight out and develop it from scratch and take on all that risk. What Paris has done in this plan is really, to me, pretty novel, which is he's broken it apart to where every one of the property owners, you could have a master developer who comes in and buys everything and does this project, but he's also created it to where you're obviously going to have to take away some of the retail, which is potentially taking away for the mall owner revenue, although they're struggling right now, so not filling all of it. So that's the argument opposite of that. But the way he's done it, but there are additional development rights that you're going to get to put on the ground, which is going to give you greater value, which is going to incentivize you to release some of that retail space. So it would make financial sense for everybody who's on the ground to be able to be a partner on this. So, and we have seen that. So Marichelle, you want to kind of give an update on kind of where we are?
So over the last year, we've met with the owners, and as you know, the vast majority of the mall was sold August of last year. So we've been in conversation with the new mall owner as well. And up until this point, everyone has been positive. Everyone is looking forward to this. I think that Paris and his team are really helping to get the ball moving, because I think without us and without our involvement, it wouldn't be moving forward, because I think it's just so much of a big task, and to have this resource, the agreement that you all approved last year, to have Paris and his group help us through this process, I think has been very instrumental in moving things forward.
I would make one other comment, and kind of finally related to something Claire said, is that there aren't many people that come in and take on all the risk and buy that. In fact, I don't think there are any groups at this point in the country that are doing that realistically. There's folks that can do it, but they're not actively out doing it, because the nature of retail is such that it's tough, and no one really knows where that's headed. However, so when we looked at this, we thought, but you do have people that own assets, they own land. They're either losing money or they're making money, but no one's in a great position out there today. We know that, or else we wouldn't be here talking. So the thought is that just in any normal business, you don't want to come in and just front a whole bunch of cash unless you can see what the return is on that. So in this case, the mall owner, their return is once zoning's in place and once there's an understanding of how the infrastructure gets financed, there's some land sales, and the proceeds from those land sales should be able to handle their side of the improvements, or a good majority of it. So that, as a business transaction, that makes sense to them, I would think. It would make sense to me. But what's tricky is if they went out today, even if they had zoning today, and there was no infrastructure agreement, just like you were talking about in the last topic, there's massive infrastructure realignment that needs to happen in this plan, any plan, frankly. And so if someone comes in and says, yeah, great, we'll buy this parcel of land and do a mixed-use building or an office building or whatever, they don't have infrastructure capacity to handle what they would do. They're not gonna put in the massive infrastructure, even for a first phase, because it's a big number. So that's why the kind of a partnering role we think is appropriate, because it does put it back in a viable operation for the market to come in and be the third side of the stool, if that makes sense.
I must say, I really like this and appreciate the effort that went into it. It reminds me almost as if Grandscape and Legacy kind of got together and had a, I don't want to say a kick, it seems bigger than both of those. I appreciate keeping the nod to the tradition of what was there before and keeping that class structure. I really like this. I'm excited about it for sure.
I was just going to say, I appreciate, I think it's beautiful, the renderings, I love it. But I think what I appreciate more than anything is the breaking it down, and if we approach it in a smart way and we make a business case for this thing, then this might actually happen. Because one of the takeaways from last year for me was, there were a couple of people that were talking about some of these REAs and how sometimes you just can't get past it, and it completely kills the whole deal. And so my takeaway from last year was, oh man, this may not happen. But I'm very, very encouraged by everything that you just said and what Claire mentioned with how we're approaching this. I'm really, really excited. I feel like we can actually get this thing to move forward. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
So
Thank you.
I love it because I've been screaming about, like TJ and I talk about this a lot. My only dream that's not in there would be, and I'm just throwing this out there in the universe, would be for us to have a full-service hotel with an actual conference center. Now that's just a dream that the market is going to determine that, but
We have a good area for that, right here.
Absolutely.
we'll figure that part out. And I don't see Liz shaking her neck at me, so I think I'm all right. I think this has an opportunity to be a revitalized area. I think we have to get involved. Otherwise, because what I do remember from the presentation is you have a good chance of getting, when the mall does not work out, we'll have a big data center. That's what we don't want. That's the nightmare scenario. So I think this is kind of like going back with Old Town, with the visioning of Old Town, what it was when I first got on council. And we were like, well, we can't get developers to come out because they don't see it. But then we showed them the vision, and now they're interactive. So I think this is a good Kickstarter to get this. And I think by phasing it, it actually makes it kind of bite-sized and something that we can get done. I love it.
Council?
Yeah, it's great. My wife even just texted me and said she loves it too. So, but anytime you're talking about, I like the fact you mentioned the rustic. I work down there. I know that area quite a bit. So anytime there's a mention of more live music, I'm all in. So, but certainly the whole development looks great.
It's great.
Bob?
So our next steps on this are we're basically going to continue conversation with the various owners. I know that the mall owner specifically has expressed like they're conceptually on board and want to move forward. They want to already move forward with entitlements, and we're like, slow down, let's get a development agreement ready and try to work through all that. And I think we need to work through it with all the other business owners out there, not business owners, what do they call anchors? Thank you. I'm thanking myself. Anchors out there. So I think we've got a long haul on this one. This is going to, like Paris says, it's not going to happen. Even if we get these development agreements in place, it's going to take a long time to get this done. But this would definitely be a great achievement for Lewisville. So we'll keep pushing forward.
Now, there's no other location in North Texas, I think, that has the amount of traffic that goes by there that's ripe for this kind of opportunity. One thing I would since we're gonna speak things into the air. I love the bite size, I love the idea. I would encourage us to push harder on getting rid of that parking in the interior. The slides are beautiful, 7, 8, and 9, but you're still like 30% of that slide is set aside for a car. And I want people in there. And so people scale, human scale, however we can do that. I would love to see a conversation with DCTA about a trolley system instead, to be able, because I get it, you got to put them somewhere. So maybe there's some flexibility or some opportunity to leverage the investment we make with our transit system in North Texas, here in Denton County, to create that, and maybe even create those pathways to the rail station across the way.
That's a great point. One thing I would point out, I think a few of you touched on it, is that, we could have drawn something on every square inch, and the more you do that, the more it starts being not accepted as easily by the marketplace, because the third partner in here is the broader market.
Right.
They're creative, they have ideas. So what this does is it sets up particularly the anchor stores as blocks of land.
Yes.
And it's probably pretty certain that folks are gonna come in with a different idea about what's there right now, maybe tearing down the building, doing something different. And once they do that, then, the value of their exercise is to, come in with stuff that, fills it in, so forth and so on. You saw that at the mall in, I think, South Dallas. There were some healthcare facilities that came in, et cetera. I'm sure that'll happen in this case too.
Super. Thank you guys so much. And Paris, thank you for your continued long-term vision and working with us on this. I know it's been a long slog, so
No,
thank you.
thank you.
If there are no other comments or questions, I think we're at a point where we can take a break. Lunch has been delivered. We will plan to, looks like it's scheduled to be kind of a working lunch today. So, yeah, we're only a few minutes behind, so let's go ahead and plan to get back started about 12:05 p.m.